All right, so today we're going to talk about email controllers. Websites are nothing without some way of sending email to people. And that there's lots of reasons to send email. One of the most common is if somebody signs up to your site, you want to validate that their email is correct. So it's no sense, as we've seen in the past, to write a regular expression to validate an email address, because that doesn't validate anything other than the characters are in the right place. It doesn't validate that it's a real email. So one of the most common emailers is to send a confirmation email to the person's email address and force them to reply to that so that you know it's a real email, that somebody actually received that email, they responded back to it, and then you can allow them to register or complete the registration in the site. So that's a common one. Another one is people, to generate traffic for your website, you need to get people to come back to your website. And as we've talked about why I make you do articles and blogs and that kind of stuff, is that we're generating pages and pages of content that people become used to seeing, and they want to see more data. So in my recipe site, what's the thing that's going to bring people back to my site? New recipes, right? New content. You know, I got a new cherry pie recipe. I got to try that out. And it would be nice if the user doesn't have to come back to my site every day to check to see if there's a new recipe. I want to notify them immediately when a new recipe is posted so that they come back and generate more traffic to my site. So whenever a new recipe is posted, I want to send an email to that person. So that's a very common way to generate more traffic coming back to your site. So whatever it is that your website is, like a contractor or a quilter or whatever you're doing, you have some knowledge base associated around that product or that service that you're selling, and that generates your traffic. So I made this little graphic to show, because email is a little difficult to follow. Rails still tries to use the model view controller concept in email generation as well, but it's a little more vague as to how it starts, because an email is going to start based on some action. Some action in your entire Rails app is going to generate some email. It's going to force something to start happening. And in the case of a user registration, that would be when a new user is created, right? We would send an email back to them now to their email address that they signed up with, and that would invoke the email. So this action can happen anywhere inside your Rails application. That's probably the hardest thing to get your head around. I can base that on, I can put an email invocation to create an actual email anywhere in my app. In a controller, for instance, I could do it when new data is saved to the database. I could put it in the model itself. I could do it anywhere I want inside my application. So what that does is the invocation is this line, which we'll talk about in a minute once we create our email controller. The email controller is going to be called, in my case, recipe mailer, and that is going to be generated. We're going to generate an email system using the same kind of thing like the scaffolding that we've done in the past. So it's going to generate a bunch of files for us that we can utilize to ship out these emails. So we call an email method on an actual class. This is going to be a recipe mailer class. We're going to call a method on it. We're going to pass it some values. And we're going to call this deliver method on that. And that invokes the email. That actually says, okay, send me out an email, and this is some data that I want you to pass along to the email to help generate the email. So that method, this send recipe method, is inside of my controller, and we'll see this in actual code in a minute. That controller can then, just like a controller for a view, you know, a normal recipe or article or blog controller, that can create instance variables and get stuff from my model. So it can go out to the model. It can say, give me a list of all the products, give me a list of all the new recipes, give me a list of whatever I want, and I can stuff that into some instance variables. And then the recipe mailer then invokes a view associated with that, and that view takes these instance variables and generates the actual email message. And then the email, and that can be either as a text email message or a full HTML message with embedded images and all that kind of good stuff. And these are the views associated with my mailer, just like a blog controller has associated blog views to see a bunch of them or et cetera. Yes?
So you have it set as recipe mailer?
Yeah.
Like if you had more than one place you wanted to send an email, would you create a different mailer for every instance?
Yes. Most likely. If it's a different type of mail, like a contact mail is going to be a specific type of mail. And I think of the type of mail based on the view that's associated with it. So I would probably generate multiple email controllers. There's lots of ways you can do it. I could just generate a different email method. Like we have methods in our controllers, I'd have one controller and multiple methods. And each method has with it associated view that describes what that email looks like.
Right.
Okay, so
It's more of a methodology.
it's a methodology, yeah. All right, so inside the view, I have access to all of the ERB commands. I can do the loops and the while loops and the if structures in the embedded Ruby, just like I would if I was creating a view for displaying an HTML page. Once that's all done, it renders that all out into a single message and it ships it out to the email address. It actually delivers the email through the email system, and they get either a text email or an HTML email. And it's very easy in Rails to send both of those. All right, so we'll come back to this as we actually generate this. And at the bottom, I have the command that is going to generate this email system. So we're going to run a generator, we're going to run a mailer generator, and we're going to pass it some values associated with that. So let's do that inside of here. I'm going to run my Rails generator. And mailer is one of the built-in generators. And just like we created a scaffold, we need some type of a name for the class, the main email controller that's going to generate. So I'm going to call mine recipe mailer. And then, just like in the beginning, in the first weeks of the class, we generated a controller and some views associated with it without the model. We just created a controller and some views. This generator takes some additional arguments, which are email types, okay, email views associated with this controller. So I'm going to create one called send recipe and one called spam, just for fun. All right, so it's going to have two different methods in my model, in my class, sorry, in my controller for my recipe mailer, and then two different views associated with each of those methods. So let's go ahead and generate that.
So no table, right?
So there is no table associated with this because we're going to use existing tables from our database to generate the email. Maybe we might use our user table, information from our user table. We might use information from our products table or our recipe table. So we're going to, and we can do any of that inside of our controller here. So these are the files that it creates, some test files that we're not going to deal with, but it creates this controller called recipemailer.rb. It creates two views, a sendRecipe.txt and a spam.txt. So let's look at the actual recipe mailer first. And it created two different methods. So first of all, we have a class called recipe mailer. It inherits everything from the action mailer base module. So that gives us a ton of methods for free again. And each method here is a different type of email. Okay, in this case, my send recipe is going to set some instance variables, and its view that's associated with that is the sendrecipe.text.erb message. Okay, so this defines what the actual email message looks like. Okay, this is the actual body of the email that gets sent out. The body of the email. So that's like a view, an HTML view. Yeah.
Is that in text or HTML?
In this case, it's in text. If we want to send HTML, we'll do it in a minute. We create a new view called sendrecipe.html.erb. And it will automatically send out the right email headers so that the HTML will be sent as well. And if you have both of the views created, it will send both the text version and the HTML version as emails to your client. Then your email client decides, can I display HTML? If it does, it takes the HTML version. It actually sends both in one email message. It's called like a multi-part MIME system. It sends one part of the message is the straight text, one is all the HTML, and your client decides which one to display. So if you have a text-based client, you're going to see just text, the text version, and you won't see any of the HTML at all. Okay, so we'll do that one in a minute. So these are the methods associated with each email, and I just need to invoke those somewhere in my program, and that email will be sent. Okay. So, any questions on that so far? All right. It's not going to go anywhere. Right. So, yeah, this is the main method that is going to be sent out, and we can set some different information here. We'll just leave it like this for now. But we need to have some way of invoking this message, okay? So what I'm going to do is create some link on my site that's going to actually call this email message, okay? So I'm going to do that in my recipe view. So if I look at my recipes and my index page, I want to perhaps on this page have a link to send this recipe to somebody. All right, so I'm going to add another table column and have a link to this particular method that will actually call this system. So again, in our little graph here, we need some way of invoking it, so we're going to call this method. We need to call that method somewhere in our system, and that's going to call the recipe mailer, and that's going to generate the view and actually send out the email. So this invocation of this mailer has to be somewhere. All right, and that's where it gets a little nebulous. So I'm going to call this send email or send recipe. And so it gets a little tricky. Where would what handles all of the information for a recipe? What handles all of the methods associated with my recipe? The controller, my recipe controller, right? So in my recipe controller, I have to have some way of taking this link and doing something with it. There's nothing built in right now. I don't have an email sender. I've got the 7 CRUD REST routes that are in here. So I need some other method in here that's going to actually allow me to send an email. So I'm going to call it send recipe. And here is where I want it to actually invoke the email. So I'm going to take that code to invoke that emailer, which is right here. See if I can actually copy it from my PDF. And I'm calling the recipe mailer class. I'm calling the send recipe method that's in that class. And I can pass some values to that if I want. Right now I'm not going to. And I'm going to call the deliver method on that. So that actually invokes the method, calls that controller, generates the views, and sends the email message out. All right? So how do I get to this send recipe? Well, I need to have a route set up such that my recipe controller will recognize this, and I can invoke that method. This is a different controller. This is a different method. Remember classes, this is a method on the recipe mailer class. This is a method on the recipe controller class. So they're different. It's not calling itself. It's calling a different class's method. It's maybe unfortunate. So let's call this something different just to not confuse you. Email recipe. How about that? All right. So then in my index, I'm going to call this email recipe, and we need to have some way of doing this. Here, we need to call my controller, and so I need a route to do that. So let's go to my routes, config, routes.rb. My recipes has nothing. I have this resources recipes. That generates the 7 methods for me. But I could add my own if I wanted. I want to say, maybe I want to get email recipe. Let's see, recipe. If that's the URL that I want to have happen, I want that to go to what controller? My recipe controller. So it's going to be recipes, and then the method that I called in my recipe controller, which is email recipe now, just for Andy. All right, so that's going to call the recipe controller and the email recipe method. And so that route should work. So let's, and I can give it an internal variable name if I want. I'll call it email recipe. That gives me those special links and creates the path for me and everything. So I can use this variable now. Let's run the rake routes and make sure that that's going to look right. And while that's running, I can go go back to my recipe index page. And for the path, it's going to be recipe, it was going to be email recipe path. So let's go look at my routes. Is still not run yet. Email recipe path should generate this path here. Come on. There we go. All right, so here's my email recipe. This is what the link is going to look like. It's going to go to my recipes controller and my email recipe method. And I can use email recipe path or email recipe URL as the built-in variables. All right, so that's in my index. So email recipe path should be fine. Let's go and look at my recipes then. Do I have an extra? Oh, I do. There we go. Thank you. Good catch. And that's probably that error right there. All right. So here's my index page. And unfortunately, my links are going off the edge. So let me stop and fix that. All right, and I don't have a TD here for this. All right, so that should, I need another TH just to make you happy here. All right. So let's look at, I deleted a couple columns because I don't want to fix my CSS right now. All right, so now I have a link over here, and if I hover over that, it comes out and says email recipe. All right, so that will call the method where? In which controller? Recipe controller. Okay, so that calls the recipe controller send email recipe method, which in turn invokes the actual emailer. Okay, so I need some way of actually getting that out. So let's do that. Nice. All right. So I have a template error. I don't have a template associated with my email recipe. That's the method here. So when I'm done emailing it, what should I do? Go back to my page. So I need to redirect, much like when I do down here, I want to redirect to the recipes path. So when I do a destroy, I want to redirect to recipes.url. Recipes URL. So let's put that here. That will redirect back to the top level, but it should have emailed it out. Let's see if I have a problem. And I have some errors.
You didn't put an email on that.
Yeah, I did. All right, so here's the actual email. So this is in the log. It lets you see the email that was actually sent. So it tried to send an email to 2@example.org. It has a date of the email, the from address, the to address. It creates the correct message IDs that email system needs. It's got a recipe a subject of send recipe. And then it sets the right MIME type. This is a text email. And then this is the actual body of the email that was in where? Where did it get that? In the view for my emailer, right? So it actually tells you here, find me in my app view, recipe mailer, send recipe.txt, which is what I have here. This is the actual body of the message. So it says greeting, hi, which was an instance variable set in the controller, and find me in, and it does, that's the actual text of the message. So it actually did invoke the email. Let's go back and make sure that my redirect works now. I can say email. It probably, yeah, there's an example. I'm sure somebody owns that, yeah. All right, so it sent it. Again, here's the new email that it got sent. And then it redirected to my recipes again, and it redisplayed my recipes. So I could do other things like put a flash message here and say my email was sent. That's probably what I'd want to do, things like that. So now I have a way of invoking that email. So let's play with the email a little more to understand that. So I'm getting all the way through. Let's look at my page again. This recipe, send recipe, deliver is invoked from this email link here. All I did was set up some way of getting that deliver method to be called. All right. That calls my recipe mailer controller. It goes out to the model maybe to get some data. It sets some instance variables, and then it calls the view. So let's play with that now. So this is my send recipe that gets called when I click on that link through two methods. It actually calls the controller for the recipe that in turn calls this email delivery system. So I can set any instance variables I want here. I can say something like recipes equals, how would I get a list of all the recipes in my site? Recipe.all. That gives me all of the recipes that are in my model, right? That will go out and do a select statement. And now recipes is what type of variable? An array of recipe objects. stored in my instance variable. Now it's available to my view that's going to play with this. And my mail method has a lot of other functions that I can send along with this. So let's go look at some of the guides for this. If I go to guides.rubyonrails.org again, this one is not in the guide index. For some reason, this has no emailer up here. So to find it, you have to just scroll on the main guides.rubyonrails, and if you scroll down here, I probably passed it. So I search for email, and I get Action Mailer Basics. I click on this link, and here is the guide that covers how to send emails. So it talks about using the generator. It talks about the views that we have, the from addresses, mail to, and it starts to show you that I can pass additional information to the mail method. Like, I want to change the subject line. I might want to change that to something specific. And then I can create a mailer view that's all in HTML. So we'll do that in a minute as well.
So what's the from used for?
The from, you have to have a from in your in an email address.
Yeah.
And typically, this default, we'll talk about that right now. Right now, it's set up when it generated it to be a default from value that the mail uses. So I could either pass in a from here. I could say from using the new hash style. I could say from dave@lockersoft.com. I could set the subject, and I'll mix hash rocket just to show you it's the same thing. This is a new recipe. And so all of these are values that are going to change, and I like to do it this way. Actually, it won't crash. It just won't do anything. But yes, good catch. So this default lets me, usually when I'm sending email from a site, I want it to come from the site's email address, or the admin's email address, or info@davesrecipes.com, or some generic email address that I'm going to look for. Maybe it's the same one that you send your questions to. Remember our contact page? You post something on the contact page, it goes to somebody. That email, whoever we're going to, could be the from address of anything we're sending out. Okay? So by default, we can set some default values here, and that's going to be from at example.com, but I can override that for a specific email.
Yeah, but the user never sees it.
Sure they do. Absolutely. That comes in the email.
They use that for people that use the
See, look at the email here. It's got a from address right here. It is actually shown. It depends on your client, email client, as to whether they see that, but it has to be there. It's part of the email protocol. Now, actually, this can be spoofed. You can make that anything you want, but
Have you ever gotten an email that didn't have a from address?
how do you know who it's from? You have to know who it's from, right?
Yeah.
That's by default. It has to have it. It has to have something. Right.
Right, but they at least have a from address.
Yeah. So I can override that. And I mixed my hash rockets here with the new style hash. This is the same thing. This is the same as this. I don't know why they did that. They saved like 3 characters typing. It's really great. I don't like it because I'm old school. I learned it this way. I don't want to change. Yeah. Whatever. So let's generate that email again and see what it looks like in my log. Let's email another recipe.
She can't email.
Yeah, I don't want to do that right now. So now I sent an email to the same person it's going to, but my from has been overridden. It's now from Dave at Lockersoft. And my subject is now, this is a new recipe. So that matches what I passed into the mail method. This is a method that's passing some values to that method. And now let's take and modify this message to have some more data associated with it. All right? So let's go in the actual mail text. And how would I loop through and print out the titles of all of my recipes? Remember, I'm.
What's your variable?
It's
Your variable is dot each.
it's in my instance variable recipe dot each do, and inside I'm going to have a single recipe that I'm going to object that I'm going to play with. Then I'm going to have an end for my do loop. And inside of this, I'm going to loop through and just display all of them. So I'm not going to I'm going to display recipe dot what? Let's look at my model. I don't remember what it is. It's the I just want the title, the name. Okay. So I'm going to send recipe dot name inside of ERB. I use an equal sign to print it out, just like I would in a HTML view. I'm describing what the body of the email is going to look like. I can put anything I want here, and that should list out then all of the recipes that I have at my site. So if I send my email again, I should have this long email. All right, there we go. So here's the same email sent to from subject is recipe, new recipe, and then here's the loop where it's printing out the title or the name of all of my recipes. So that shows you how I can get at any of my models that I have in my database and get select pieces out of that. So it did the select for me to get the data from the database. It then let me loop through them. And isn't that cool? That's sweet stuff. So one more thing, and then we'll talk some more about this tomorrow. But if I want to send this as HTML, all I have to do is create a new file, a new view, based on the name of the method that's in my controller. So notice that this is called send recipe. My views are called send recipe.text.erb. If I want to send an HTML version of that, I would say send recipe.html.erb. So I just need to copy that file in my view. These are all in my recipe mailer view. So I have a send recipe text and a spam.text. If I copy this and paste it and rename it to HTML, all right, now I can actually put HTML in this instead. I could put a break tag at the end of these, or I could make these a list element. Let's do an ending LI and an open LI around each one. Put an ordered list maybe around the whole thing. Got to indent correctly, right? All right, so this lets me have actual HTML in here to describe what this is going to look like. So now I have two different emails actually going out, but it's sending one email with two of these combined together into one email. All right, two views defined into one, and that's a standard email system built into the email protocol. So let's invoke another email. Goes through the system. And now you see, here's my mail. This is this is one MIME portion. This is the text version. The text plain is the content type of this part. This is a MIME part. So that's the text version. If I scroll down, Now this is my email, my HTML version of that same email. So that all gets compacted together, and your email client decides which one to display. And now you see I've got OLs in here and all that kind of stuff. Isn't that great? So that's a quick run through of email. We'll go into some more detail tomorrow and play around with it, how to pass some data into these methods from the invocation. Because as you see now, if I go to my email recipe, nowhere in here does it tell me which recipe to email. This is just emailing everything. I want to email one specific recipe, so I'm going to have to pass some data through this email system all the way to the end so that I can look for the right data. And that's what I'm talking about, these passed values. So that data has to be sent all the way through so I can get specific data for my email. All right, any questions on that? Yeah.
I didn't confused because right now you have an email controller, right?
Yeah.
And right now you add one view HTML.
Right.
So, but why you don't upgrade controller, email controller, to add this action? You don't need to do that.
No, because Rails is built in. One action has a view associated with it. And so if Rails sees two views that start with the same name, it's going to combine those two views together into one email. It's different ways of looking at the data. Right. If you have a text-only email client, then you'll only see the text version of that. It's like two letters in the same envelope. Some guy can only read text, and one could only read HTML.
Okay, so it's not an email. So if, for example, if product or whatever, I add one view in and the same name before, so they will work.
Yes.
They will work same thing, right?
Yep.
They will combine together.
Yeah, if I wanted to have an HTML version of my spam text, I'd have a spam.html.erb. I'd have both files. So two different files describe what the email will look like in HTML versus text. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, you can pass in anything from the original invocation and pass data. You could pass whole objects. You can pass anything you want all the way through the system and get it to your email. So lots of ways to do that. Yeah.
So how I can control, for example, right now you send, you combine together to send.
Yeah.
But is anything I can put if else? So in some condition I can send one, sometimes I can send both.
Well, yeah, you could do that but I wouldn't do it here. I would do it when I invoke the email. So in my controller, my recipe controller, I could do that here. I could say if spam, do invoke my spammer email instead. Else send my recipe emailer. And I changed the name of the method now. And now my spam is going to call this method instead. And that would have different views associated with it. So if you want to send different emails, that's where you do it up there, higher up the chain. All right? Any other questions? All right. That's it for today.